Here's some exclusive video we obtained of the president at a fundraiser just over the weekend.
Institutions matter. And this president, what he did on January the 6th, to hear what he's saying now, he said if he doesn't win, there'll be a bloodbath. It's outrageous what he's talking about.
It's outrageous what he's talking about. Hard to argue with that. Starting us off tonight is Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California. Congressman, it's great to see you, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about this because you know so much as somebody who was on the select committee that investigated January 6th about these events, what led up to them. And we've talked a lot about this before, but I kind of just went through some of the language that Trump, Lara Trump, Steve Bannon, and others have been using in recent days and weeks. And it seems to me like they're laying the groundwork for another effort. But I want to know what you hear from it. Is it something different from what led up to 2020, or is it similar in your view?
It's similar, and it's even worse, particularly when you hear Steve Bannon basically saying, you know, fight or die, because Trump is doing what he did prior to the last election, which is laying the seeds that if he loses, that he will challenge it as illegitimate, that there's no way he can lose. And, you know, look, the thing that Donald Trump fears more than anything else is being labeled a loser. He's probably even more willing to be called a felon than he is a loser. But he's a loser, and he's desperately afraid that he may lose again. And if he does lose again, he wants to challenge the results. And so he is laying the foundation. But we saw with even less incendiary rhetoric 4 years ago that it led to a violent confrontation, a mob descending on the Capitol. Now that they are just escalating the rhetoric, probably with even greater fears of losing. And, you know, added to this for Trump, I think he feels if he doesn't win, he's going to jail. And so he has all the more reason to contest any losing result. But it is more the same, but even more dangerous.
You know, one of the things we talk about a lot here on the show is just how much we should be concerned about something, because we're not trying to scare people. His rhetoric is certainly scary, but he has tried to whip up his supporters to show up around his court appearances. He hasn't been successful. At the same time, again, this language is scary. How should you, as you're talking to your neighbors, as you're campaigning across California, what are you telling people about the level of concern they should have?
Well, I'm encouraged by the fact that, as you say, he encouraged people to rise up if he were prosecuted. They didn't rise up. There wasn't this massive protest. He was convicted. It caused barely a stir, I think, among his most rabid base in terms of any public protest. But at the same time, you can't discount the chance that if he loses again, when he loses again, that he will go to even greater lengths to try to overturn the results. And what I do tell people is the worst case scenario is that the result is close. That instead of a broad victory like we saw by Joe Biden 4 years ago, where he won in numerous battleground states by pretty good margins, let's say it comes down to a single state. And there I really do worry. And there is simply no institution we can rely on. I would not want to rely on the Supreme Court in another close presidential contest any more than we saw in Bush v. Gore. And because there's such little confidence in the court, that would be, I think, a different kind of catastrophe. But the only remedy really is the one in all of our hands, and that is to make sure that Joe Biden wins overwhelmingly, that this is not close. That is the best way to avoid, I think, any kind of instability post-election.
You know, Congressman, one of the challenges that you've warned about and others have warned about from the committee is just the role of enablers. And Trump and Mike Johnson met today in Mar-a-Lago. It was also reported in the last few days that Trump called Mike Johnson to ask him for his help in overturning the conviction. That's not a role, as far as I understand the rules of the House, that the House could play, even a Speaker of the House. But are there tactics, or what could he use if he wanted to, Mike Johnson, to run interference here or try to have an impact on a conviction that was done in a state court?
Well, they are really already trying to do that. Mike Johnson has been trying to do that for some time, acting through the Judiciary Committee, where the committee that I serve on under Jim Jordan has been subpoenaing witnesses from the Manhattan DA's office and subpoenaing documents and trying to attack Alvin Bragg, holding field hearings in Manhattan, as our committee did, with the idea of somehow trying to embarrass Alvin Bragg. None of it has been successful, but it is a clear effort by Johnson through Judiciary Committee, through the Oversight Committee, to do Trump's bidding and try to discredit this prosecution. There's no way we can overturn it. There are ways that, we can further cause mischief, which I think the speaker's trying to do. And, you look at Trump's continuing influence on, for example, telling Johnson who to put on the Intelligence Committee, puts, two of his firebrands on that committee. That's a real national security problem and threat. So he's already doing enough of the president's bidding, the former president's bidding, to be of grave concern.
I was interested in your view on that because, it's been reported, and this I don't think will surprise you as the former chairman of the Intelligence Committee, that not just Democrats but Republicans who are a part of that committee are upset about the naming of Congressman Scott Perry and Ronny Jackson, who were the people you were referencing. Talk to me a little bit about the impact and the risk of having people like that on the committee who were named reportedly by the Speaker of the House, and then even the chairman of the committee wasn't given a heads up on it.
It is amazing that, down to the micromanaging of who Johnson puts on committees, Trump is still calling the shots. But putting someone like Scott Perry on the committee, someone whose own cell phone records were subpoenaed by the Justice Department, someone who was involved in trying to install Jeffrey Clark, this totally unqualified person at the Justice Department in the environmental section, to install him as Trump's attorney general because he thought he would be more useful in overturning the results of the election. Someone like that on the committee who's, involved already in an ongoing investigation. What it will mean is the intelligence agencies are simply not going to share the kind of information with the committee as a whole because they can't trust him. And so it undermines the oversight role of the committee if the agencies aren't comfortable sharing with you. Sadly, though, he will have access to a lot of highly classified written material, and there's not much that can be done about that. So I'm not surprised that even some of the Republican members are unhappy with these choices. I have to think both the chair and ranking member of the Intelligence Committee are both unhappy about this. And again, it shows the weakness of Speaker Johnson and the continued dominance of Donald Trump.